system.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to you wherever you are from the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy at the Judge Business School of the University of Cambridge. Absolutely delighted to have you all with us here today for our second in this series of seminars on shifting the power, looking at the dynamic in philanthropy between the Global South and the Global North. Our centre inside the Judge Business School is focused specifically on emerging market philanthropy and particularly the Middle East, Africa and Southeast Asia. We have a research portfolio, an executive education programme and thought leadership events such as this one. So this is, as I said, the second session in our 10-part series, looking specifically at beyond grants. How can we drive system change across the ecosystem, looking at financial instruments, but not just exploring this move beyond grants and how the sector has now embraced other financial instruments to deliver impact, but also looking at how that move has changed power dynamics and whether this diversity of instruments has helped to bring the ecosystem together and offset some of its historical fragmentation. Just a quick note on housekeeping. There will, of course, be time for questions from the floor after the discussions, and we indeed welcome them from our audience. Please note to submit your questions to the Q&A rather than the chat box, because that allows you in a democratic fashion, which we champion, to upvote the questions and to pick your favorite question so that we can respond to those that have been most popular. We will try to get through all of the questions, but obviously time may get the better of us. We will close out at 11:30 British Summer Time, but if you do have to leave early, please note that the session will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So do check that out later. And indeed, our first session is already broadcast there. So let me start by just doing a quick introduction to our panelists. So delighted to have with us today, first of all, Dr. Kamal Munir, our academic director at the Centre for Strategic Philanthropy and also the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University. We have Frank Aswani, who is the CEO of the African Venture Philanthropy Alliance, with us today from South Africa. We have Naina Batra, who's the chairperson and CEO of the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network. We have Isabelle Irani, the co-founder of the Sumerian Foundation, and Sriskandarajah, the CEO of Oxfam UK. So good morning and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I know this is going to be a very exciting discussion from the earlier insights we've already gleaned from you. So really looking forward to that. But let me just give a quick background to the series. So this series, the purpose of this series of seminars is really to further explore some of the issues that we discovered in the research that we did last year. We did our first industry report on COVID and how that was shifting the dynamics, the power dynamics between the Global South and the Global North. And as part of that work, we actually discovered that many were already working in this space and that indeed the hashtag Shift the Power already existed. And as of May this year, I believe we've had the website up and running. So we started to realize that there were others working on this topic and wanted to build on that and help create this community. In particular, of course, there was the Global Fund for Community Foundations in South Africa, who had their event yesterday talking to a similar topic. And really, we wanted to be able to align with other organizations rather than reinvent the wheel. And indeed, at yesterday's event, it was very interesting to see not only people talking about how Shift the Power had moved from a hashtag to a movement, but we actually had specific examples of how power dynamics had changed under COVID. And the Ghana Star Foundation was just one example of how, due to COVID and the implications of COVID, had started to build a much more locally based funding strategy. So I think this is an exciting time for all of us. Also, there is actually a map, which we're going to share with you via the chat, that the Global Fund for Community Foundations has created to map the actors in this space, both in terms of their geographies, in terms of the nature of the organization, and how they are networking. We are a big fan of networks, as I'm sure are many of our panelists, but I think that's a very interesting space for people to join so that we can start to map the movement and understand where we can most add value. Our first seminar, as I said, is already on the YouTube channel. So if you want to have more background to this event, then please do have a look at that. And now, just before we jump into our panels, we'd like to run just a couple of polling questions to see what you as the audience think at the outset of this discussion. So we're going to pull up poll number 1. So my colleague Jack is going to pull that up for you. So there you'll see that the question is there a need, sort of a validation for our session today, for philanthropists to move beyond grants in emerging markets? So you have options of yes, no, or unsure. So if you can all just sign up to the poll there, give us your opinions, tell us what you think. And once we have a good amount of attendees voting, we will pull up the results. So is there a need for philanthropists to move beyond grants in emerging markets? Yes, no, or unsure. So we have the results there. 81%, that's good, justifies our event. 81% of you said that yes, there is a need for philanthropists to move beyond grants in emerging market. 4% say no, and 15% unsure. So that's great. Thank you for sharing your opinions with us. And that gives us a wonderful start then to explore that. If the majority do believe we should move beyond grants, why and how, and what does that mean for power dynamics? So let's start today's discussion. I'm going to turn first to Isabelle Irani. So Isabelle is the co-founder of Sumerian Partners, an organization that is working to improve impact in the philanthropic sector. Isabelle herself has a background in asset management and indeed in VC, and she has worked in the finance sector for many years before being asked by friends and colleagues to bring her expertise to the impact space, to the philanthropy space. So Isabelle, I want to ask you, since you're kind of a bit of an embodiment of this phenomenon. So 10 or 15 years ago in the philanthropic sector, we pretty much only talked about grants. We were grant city, and that was the chosen financial instrument of choice. Now, you were part of that movement that we've witnessed over the last few years, where finance, people working in finance, professionals in finance, not only increasingly wanting to work in philanthropy for social purpose, but also increasingly interested in investing in philanthropy. We've seen high net worth wanting to have an element of their portfolio in philanthropy. We've seen banks create dedicated philanthropic arms in order to advise their clients. So talk to us a little bit around why you think that happened in the first place. How did this rapprochement from finance and social purpose communities come together? Why did that happen, and your own experience therein? And then talk to us a little bit about how, if we are going to look at financial instruments beyond grants, how easy is that? How easy is it for traditional philanthropists working with grants to become experts on a more diverse and complicated array of instruments?
Thank you, Claire. So just for some background in terms of in VC. So when I was in VC, we would always provide unrestricted funding. We were backing a management team, but besides for the unrestricted funding that we were providing, we provided immense skills support to help the organization succeed. We never expected a PhD in physics who was building a semiconductor chip to be an expert in scaling a business. So I was very young at the time, and I took that for granted. And I then moved to the philanthropic space, and I said, how do I use these skill sets while I was in VC and apply it to philanthropy? And we saw, well, first of all, for social purpose organizations, they're even more cash strapped than commercial organizations that VCs are backing. They have no capacity. Often funding is restricted, right? So it does not enable you to build a strategy and pivot when needed, because inevitably challenges happen. And then also you need the right form of finance based on the stage you are. So it's not a one size fits all. In some cases, you do need grants are absolutely needed, but as you grow, you need different forms of finance. Not only that, different business models require different forms of finance. And then lastly, wherever you are in the world, you can't expect a person who's an expert in education who's delivering in the disadvantaged communities to be an expert at everything, right? So you can't expect that. You need the skills support to help this entrepreneur succeed to get to the place that they have to be. So that requires another level of skill set. I'll stop there, Claire. I hope that addressed the question.
Yeah, that's great, Isabelle. And we will, of course, come back to that skill set, because that is, of course, something that people are grappling with across the sector. I mean, it's certainly something I think we see even in our own executive education programs, that philanthropists who, like you said, have deep socioeconomic development expertise don't necessarily know how to launch a social impact bond, and yet that is becoming the topic of the era, is how do we deploy these more complicated financial instruments. So we will come back to that point, Isabelle, and specifically looking at how you build that capacity, the capacity to deal with different instruments. But I want first to turn to Danny. So Danny, you in your career, both earlier at the Royal Commonwealth Society, the Commonwealth Foundation, and no doubt working, for example, as a trustee of the Guy's and St. Thomas's Foundation, you've been a champion, as of course as Oxfam, of inequality, rather of lack of not having inequality. And particularly during COVID, Oxfam's been quite vocal about this being the inequality virus. So Oxfam, I think, from challenging the billionaires at Davos to just being a really strong force for researching this issue. This is not new to Oxfam, this idea of shifting the power dynamic. But I imagine that in recent times, with this new influx of different types of financial instruments, this has honed the discussion somewhat. Now that you're seeing a broader array of ecosystem actors coming into this space, what is your thinking on how financial instruments, having a more diverse range, does that help or hinder the ecosystem and the power dynamics?
Yeah, no, thanks, Claire. Well, the simple answer is it helps. And I think this sort of conversation, especially as we think about how to build back better or a just recovery from COVID, I think this is a really timely conversation to think about how do those of us who want to, power or fund or resource social change or social good, how should we be responding? So I think this is a super timely question. Just a reminder of what's happening in the wider world in terms of COVID impacts, in case anyone, isn't aware. We're very acutely aware of the health impacts, but what's becoming very clear to us at Oxfam, we're delivering COVID response in something like 60 countries at the moment, is that the economic impacts of the disruption caused by COVID are huge and are going to last for generations if we don't do something about it. There are more people in need of humanitarian assistance today than there have been since the Second World War. We're expecting hundreds of millions of people to be pushed back into extreme poverty as a result of economic shocks, of the fact that global trade has been disrupted because tourism has been disrupted. And so, while many of us thought at the start of this pandemic that this would be the great leveler because, all of us were equally likely to get the disease, what actually seems to be happening is we're seeing a great reversal of so many of the gains we've seen in economic and social development in recent decades. But I'm still optimistic because it seems, though, when you look around the world, that there are really unexpected things happening. Finance ministers are throwing the rule book out the window and coming up with interventions that one couldn't have imagined. We have the United States government supporting a compulsory waiver of intellectual property rights on the COVID vaccine. Who would have thought the US would back something like that? And so it also feels like a moment where, those of us, again, in social change, interested in social good, should be throwing the rule book out the window. And I think the question of what instruments we use to support and nurture and make the most of this moment is really timely for that reason. And particularly because, I've pretty much worked in civil society for all of my career. I've been a consumer, if you will, of philanthropy for 20 years. And I really think that philanthropy done well is one of the most powerful forces in support of social good. And especially at a time when, official aid budgets are being slashed. We have the tragic case in the UK this week where the government has reneged on its promise on international aid and cutting the aid budget by 4 billion in the middle of a global pandemic. We also know, as Isabelle's just said, some of those instruments we've had, like grants, which have become very constraining. I mean, what a contrast between, Isabelle, your experience as a VC investor, empowering leaders, giving them unrestricted funding, to the way that often, not always, but often grants work, highly restricted, highly conditional, full of paperwork, full of reporting. And so I think we need to come up with different interventions to make, especially at this moment. And the two reasons that jump out for me from our experience of Oxfam for why we need to do that have to do with scale and impact, and to do with voice and power. And I hope we can talk a bit about that in this discussion, because I think, what we're struggling at is, we do need interventions that have the ability to transform economies, transform social norms, intervene in ways that will deliver that sort of radical change, deliver on the radical potential. And I think grants can help, but it sort of seems accidental that a good grant leads to massive social change. And we need to come up with a diverse portfolio of interventions that will maximize our ability to deliver at scale. And then power, which is, especially in the international aid system, I worry that money might trickle down, but power certainly doesn't. That the further you go down the grant making chain or the philanthropic chain, the less power you have. And once you become a sub-grantor of a sub-grantor, you don't really get to call any shots. And that's not sustainable. And it's certainly not going to help us sort of make the most of this moment, because this moment, the response has to be sort of bottom up. We have to invert that power pyramid. And so I think when we're thinking about saying this is a moment where philanthropy done well can make a massive and strategic difference, I think a portfolio of interventions have to be part of that. And especially if we're thinking about scale and impact. So that's a long way of saying, yes, it will help. Thanks.
No, but that's a brilliant way of saying it, because you raise multiple issues there. I mean, bizarrely, perhaps the least obvious, philanthropy done well. Why isn't philanthropy done better? I think all of us that have been working in the sector for decades, we started off in the 90s talking about aid effectiveness, and now we're talking about philanthropic effectiveness. Why are we still talking about effective? Why isn't it effective? Why are we still struggling to ensure that grant funding, philanthropic interventions do create outcomes at scale? And I think, and we'll hear shortly from Naina on the issue of grants, but grants maybe get a bad rap because sometimes perhaps it's not the grant per se, but it's the way the grant is deployed. So as you were saying, as Isabelle was saying, if it's restricted, then it's limiting. And yet also, as you say, Danny, we have seen great innovation. We've seen the Ford Foundation issue a bond. Hallelujah. Let's look at how we can get more innovative in way philanthropic organizations themselves fund themselves. But then, of course, they are a very different category with a very strong balance sheet, unlike many of the social purpose organizations that we're looking at in emerging markets. So thank you. Lots to pick up on there. But let me go first to Frank. So Frank, you have been, since we have started talking, since you brilliantly set up the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance a few years ago, about the importance of impact investing, and that, this is clearly a new opportunity. It's a new way of bringing new capital to the social space, both from individual high net worth, but even institutional investors. And yet there are real challenges, right? So we see the potential and the opportunity of impact investing, but there are real challenges. And I know that one of the things you're working on is building that capacity and knowledge. But talk to us a little bit about why you think bringing impact investing to this space is so important, and what needs to happen for it to have what Danny was talking about, the scale of impact and empowered voices.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And Claire, thank you for pulling this together. This is a really important subject. When you ask the question why it's important now, I think in life generally, when we are facing challenges and we try different solutions, when they don't work, we tend to review the solutions and we tend to see what we need to do differently. If you look at Africa, for example, we are we've been beneficiaries of aid and grant capital for the longest. Since I was born, growing up in Kenya, we went to schools that were funded by aid money, coming through different channels. Hospitals that we attended were funded by missionaries and faith-based giving. So there's a lot of beneficiaries kind of channels that came to Africa in that context. But our population in Africa has grown tremendously. As you know, our average age is only 19 in Africa compared to like 38 or 40 in the US and 51 in Japan. We're adding in the range of 1 million young people a month onto this continent. And there's definitely there's a mismatch between the demand for support to improve the lives of Africans and the supply of capital to deliver that support. In a sense, actually, I think the COVID crisis did us a favor in one way. It brought that crisis, an unsustainable funding mechanism, to the fore much quicker. We're never going to live on aid for life. We've been too over dependent on it. As Danny says, the reduction in aid has come at a time when we probably needed it to be increasing. The US government in Trump's time reduced aid through USAID, and in some countries, USAID funding is up to 40% of the social financing budget. It's just not sustainable. So we've got to be. This is a time to press the reset button, and I think, as they say, don't waste a crisis. This is a good opportunity for us to be rethinking about this. How do we not waste this COVID crisis to do something differently for the continent? If you look at our SDG financing, the continent needs between $500 billion to $1.2 trillion annually between now and 2030. Money for this has come generally from aid, which is about $50 billion a year, FDI about another $40 billion a year, and government funding, which is about $600 billion a year. So put all of that together, it's not even half of what we require. So we can't be depending on Africa's progress based on sources of capital that are not adequate. This is where we need to think differently. And I think this is a role that philanthropy needs to play. And to Danny's point, philanthropy done well, I'd probably say philanthropy done well and differently. Yeah. How do we use philanthropy catalytically in this context? How do we use philanthropy to unlock other pools of capital, like in the private sector, to come into this space? And this is where the mindset shift needs to happen. But it's a mindset shift that requires, and Danny, I totally agree with you, a bottoms-up approach where we're sourcing the problems and the solutions from the people who've lived through the crisis, not so much from people who are supplying the capital, but also we're being creative about how we deploy the capital. And I think this is a time that we really need to be thinking differently. But Claire, as you correctly put it, it also needs a different skill set. Mm-hmm. We can't have grant makers just giving out all their money as grants. We can't have technocrats not being creative and innovative about how they're shaping the policies to drive this space. We can't have international players coming into Africa and dictating solutions, those kind of things. So I think this is a really good space and time for us to press the reset button.
Thanks, Frank. And I'm going to come back to you on that point about if there is a growth in impact investing, for example, but there isn't the local knowledge and expertise, does that then create dependence externally on knowledge? But we'll come back to that. I like the way you said, it's not just about philanthropy done well, philanthropy done differently, because as you point out, young people that we're seeing coming into this sector just ain't interested in setting up a foundation, in my experience. They're much more interested in creating something entrepreneurial, a fund or a social enterprise. And I think that's very significant, because that level of innovation coming from younger generations is also perhaps enticing the private sector in and saying, hey, there's an opportunity for you here. This is not just that old-fashioned clunky grant-making stuff. We're talking about value creation, and that back to, the kind of background that Isabelle has, the VC, it's about value creation. Instead of commercial value creation, what we're talking about is social value creation, but the principles are often the same, which leads me nicely into Naina. So AVPN, in a way, was born out of that kind of philosophy around bringing private sector innovation and, of course, the model of venture capital into venture philanthropy. And you, as a network, have really done a great job of uniting everybody from pure banks to financiers to foundations to social entrepreneurs to very grassroots organizations. So tell us a little bit, Naina, about what you think, because it's quite a unique, in a way, experience I think you've had at AVPN. I'm not sure that kind of network existed before, where you had such a wide range of actors coming under one umbrella and such a big community. And now you have a pretty powerful voice in Asian philanthropy. Tell us about why you think that's important and why this bringing together of very diverse actors and very diverse financial instruments is so important for philanthropic impact.
Thanks, Claire. And, it's been fascinating to hear everyone else talk before me. I think one of the reasons AVPN has expanded as it has, and I've been with AVPN for almost 8 years as their CEO, and we've gone very much beyond, I think, what the founder imagined venture philanthropy to be when he set up AVPN. And I think part of the reason is, the crux of what we're discussing today, the power dynamics. I mean, I think Asia, the AVPN is a true Asian network. It's a network that's set in Asia. We are present in 13 countries in Asia. Our members all work in Asia. The decision makers are Asian. And, oftentimes what actually happens, and Claire, you and I have discussed this so many times, right, is that especially for the global South, especially for countries in the global South, a lot of times we're looking at models that come from the West. And this is a personal pet peeve of mine, so excuse me, and I don't intend to insult anyone or offend anyone, but who says Western models are what is going to work in our economies? I mean, there is no reason for us to not look within ourselves, within our neighbors, because if you really look at it, Indonesia has far more in common with India. The Philippines has far more in common with what is happening in Cambodia and Laos than they do in what has happened in Europe or in the US. Why should we be making the same mistakes that Western philanthropists have made? And therefore, I think AVPN has done well because we are talking about Asian solutions for Asian problems. And we are actually giving a voice to different types of innovation, including innovative social finance that is happening in Asia. And you really look at it, I was talking yesterday on a panel around healthcare and looking at blended finance in healthcare, and the number of initiatives that have actually come up post the pandemic in Asia. There was a few years back, the flavor of the season was social impact bonds, and everybody wanted to set up a social impact bond. But I think, Asians have moved beyond that. They're looking at what kinds of instruments make sense for them in their own sort of ecosystems, looking at solving their own problems. And that is where philanthropy, I think, has started to play a much more effective role. It has started to play a role where it comes in as a catalyst, as an enabler, as some of you have actually talked about. AVPN itself has launched its first collaborative pooled fund, the first collaborative pooled fund of its kind in Asia, where we've had 6 completely different organizations come together. And this is where, again, building on Danny, Isabelle, Frank, all of the things that you guys said, we decided very early on that the type of grants we would make would be unrestricted operating expenses grants as part of that philanthropic pooled fund. And what I find interesting is each of those organizations, we have about $2.5 million that we're giving away. But each of the organizations that have come together in this pooled fund individually don't do operating expenses unrestricted grants. So the thing to also think about, what is interesting, is that philanthropists, when they come together and they collaborate, tend to be more brave, they tend to be more innovative, they tend to have a greater appetite for risk. And the final thing I'll say before we, I hand it back to you. Let's look at sort of switching the power dynamic. At the end of the day, nonprofits, social enterprises, entrepreneurs on the ground need to step up and say, hey guys, we are what make you look good. We are the people who make philanthropists look good. If we didn't exist, you wouldn't be able to go there and sort of, feel really amazing and proud of yourself for what you're doing, because it is the work that we do on the ground that is, that gives you cause to be. So that is where the power dynamic has to shift. And we have to bring these voices to the decision-making table. And that's what's important.
I think that's a really important point that you make, Naina, that we don't make often enough, that the demand side doesn't have enough voice. And it's certainly something that's informing some of our research. We're looking at doing some work potentially in Nigeria around looking at the demand side. So we talk about what impact investors want to invest in, but what do people actually need, and what is the nature of the finance? So that's great that you mention it, and also powerful that you mention. So even people who normally don't give unrestricted funding, when they come together, might go, oh, well, actually, if everybody else is doing it, I'll do.
Exactly.
The importance of that community coming together and thus changing the practices of philanthropy and empowering. And also, just to mention again, your point about Asia, I think that we're seeing growth in philanthropic capital is coming predominantly. I don't have the latest statistics, and no doubt COVID has changed, growth projections for most economies, but certainly pre-COVID, of course, we were expecting growth and hence this intergenerational wealth transfer to come predominantly from Asia. And what a great opportunity, therefore, for Asia to drive the discourse around which financial instruments work best. Now, I am going to come straight back to Isabelle, although I will jump around. But so if we talk about financial instruments, Isabelle, we all decided that you, as a former financier, not necessarily a banker, would be the person to deconstruct the financial instruments. But that's not what I'm going to ask you to do. But I think you have some really interesting experience around, again, relating your former experience as a venture capitalist to a venture philanthropist. You were saying that you fund social entrepreneurs, that's the focus of your work, and that often you find that their lack of financial expertise or capacity undermines their power and is a real problem. And often you find again, the supply side is not willing to address that. So talk to us about what needs to change in the way we ready social entrepreneurs to deal with different instruments.
Yes, great question. First of all, the supply side to date is very product driven. It's not driven by what's in the best interest of the social entrepreneur. In other words, I have a bond, I have equity, this is all I have, right? So you then put the onus back onto the social entrepreneur. Is this the right instrument? They probably don't know. The other thing is as these organizations are incredibly constrained in terms of resources, they may be creating phenomenal impact, to Naina's point, phenomenal impact in education, but they haven't had the time nor resource to sit back and build a strategy. They're just in this hamster wheel. So they need the time and money or advice to help someone build a strategy and build what does that look like, which then translates to how much money do I need to raise and what does that instrument look like. What we really need from the supply side is not to be so it's one size fits all. It is not one size fits all. SIBs are for certain circumstances, debt is for certain circumstances, equity is for certain circumstances. But not only that, we are being exclusive by nature if we don't enable and help social entrepreneurs to help build that strategy, to help build that. So you're right now being exclusive because you will say, I'm only funding someone who's come to me with a bulletproof strategy, a bulletproof 3-year forecast, knowing exactly how much they're going to raise. So you're now making an assumption that everything's in place. So the current structure between the demand, what the demand side needs with the supply side, there's a mismatch right now. I mean, we addressed a little bit of this with an Oxfam report several years ago, Danny. So there's a massive gap right now in terms of providing, we would call it pre-investment skill support, whether that's done by a third party or by the finance provider. We are agnostic to that, but we absolutely need more pre-investment skill support in this sector if they were to be investment ready. And to Danny's point earlier, scale these investments, scale these social entrepreneurs.
Thanks, Isabelle. Yeah, and I wanna ask Danny shortly. I'm gonna come first to Frank, but Danny, for you to ponder this while Frank intervenes around what's being done. I mean, obviously you've been a grant recipient, but what's being done to help build capacity in this sector? But before we go to that point, Frank, let's just come back to impact investing. So, you make this very powerful case of the opportunity of impact investing in Africa. This will hopefully allow for reduction, obviously, in grants and aid, although they are extremely important, and we should reiterate that because they help buy down risk. And you're looking at building capacity with the fellowship you've created, and you've talked to us before about the need for, board members to be brought up to speed on the opportunity of impact investing. Is there a danger that entrenches an unequal power dynamic if Africa is dependent on bringing expertise on impact investing from the West?
Not necessarily so. I think if you look at the need for competence, right now we're in a stage where we don't know what we don't know. State of very unconscious incompetence in many ways. But as the way capital moves globally changes, we need to be in tune with that. But in the context of that, we need to still find a way of taking that global knowledge and localizing it. What does it look and feel for Africa? So one of the biggest mistakes we made in Africa, for example, is take the VC model, Silicon Valley model, and try and copy and paste it into Africa. It struggled to work. Okay, those are the things we must learn from what we've done in the past. How do we take these models and Africanize them, localize them? Should we be making sure that exits are longer, for example, in some investments we make on the continent, just because of the different structural things that an African entrepreneur faces? But what we should be careful about not to be left behind. The opportunity cost for us being left behind is huge. We need to make sure that we take whatever's happening globally, join the global movement, but see how that is contextualized for the continent. And that's what people like us should be trying to support and do, bringing on board our institutions of learning, practitioners already working in Africa, connecting with other global South practitioners who are trying to solve very similar problems in very similar environments. So it's not just a problem for Africa, it's a problem, I think it's a question that Naina could answer for Asia, and someone could answer for Latin America as well. But I think as a global South, where we have very similar challenges, we need to be asking ourselves that question: how do we take global trends and instruments and make them perfect and workable for our areas?
And is one of the challenges therein, it's certainly something that our research is the role of government. So this whole issue of institutional voids in emerging markets, because if you're talking about, exit and trying to create, Silicon Valley, presumably there is a strong role for governments, and presumably governments are also struggling to figure out these new instruments, how to regulate them, how to deploy them. Is that something that the sector can work on? Is it something you guys are working on?
You're 100% correct, Claire. There's no way we can do this without pulling our technocrats along. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the decisions go back to their desks. If they don't understand how this space works and operates, we'll be banging our head against walls for the next 20 years, because they won't approve some of the things we're trying to do. They won't give us the regulatory wriggle room we need to make these things work. So some of the programs we're looking at are to try and see what can we do to capacitate governments to better understand this new innovative financing space? Because you don't want to go to the government and ask them to approve a new instrument, whether it's an SIB or an outcome-based financing, and they don't have a clue what it's about. It's meaningless. So we've got to make sure that we move this thing along. Now, having said that, the joy of one of the things about the developing world and African emerging markets is, in many cases, innovations precede regulation. Okay, so we've got a really good opportunity whereby we can use innovation to create regulation, and not the other way around. I think this is one of the big differences between like Africa and the US. In the US, there's over-regulation in many cases. You look at things like M-Pesa, look at things like zipline technology. They preceded regulation, and now regulation is trying to work around them. So there's really good opportunities. And I always say, if you're playing an impact globally, Africa and the emerging markets are your best sandbox.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think COVID, we've seen this, that COVID has been a bit of a wake-up call for governments that, actually those guys in the third sector are doing something pretty innovative, and they're raising funding, and they're funding stuff, and we need more funding and more innovation. So it seems there's a bit of a rapprochement between governments, certainly foundations. We've seen examples of foundations working with governments since COVID that might not have happened historically. So thank you for that, Frank. So Danny, coming back to you on the whole, so you've been a recipient of grant finance. You're now with Oxfam, which, is pretty much part of the international development community. The international development community, for so long, we've been calling it out, saying we need to build capacity. Are you seeing a shift in how capacity is being built in the global South in terms of dealing with new financial instruments? But just more broadly, are we moving away from, be it INGOs or donors, just funding programs and saying, actually, we need to fund institutional development?
I'm ambivalent on that question, because I think there are some good signs, there are some good measures, a lot more, if you just follow the Shift the Power hashtag in the last few years, there's a lot of excitement, as you said, Claire, at the start, around these sorts of conversations. But are the systems and structures actually changing? I'm not so sure, particularly in the traditional institutions that live in our sort of in the international development sector. In some ways, they're going backwards. They're becoming more risk averse, more bureaucratic, creating ever more hurdles for those of us who want to empower local partners. But I'm ambivalent though, because there are, as always, there's opportunity here to sort of disrupt and do things very differently. One is a sort of philosophical disruption that I see happening, which is, you know, if you take the third sector or civil society, whatever you want to call it, my reading is for the last 20, 30 years, we've seen civil society as a means towards delivery, right? So you build a sort of delivery infrastructure, you put in some inputs of grants and you expect things to come out the other end, and it doesn't matter who delivers it, it just, whereas I think there is a realization that actually a strong, vibrant, independent, diverse network of civic actors or third sector is an integral part, is an end in itself of a high functioning dynamic society. And so therefore, if you want to support strong institutions close to the ground, you need mechanisms that strengthen those their capacity and strengthen their resilience. And therefore, traditional sort of top-down interventions aren't going to give you that, because, you know, you'll end up, as I said before, in a sort of long chain with very disempowered, weak, sort of upward-looking actors who aren't grounded in their local communities and local societies. And so one of the reasons I'm excited about the new tools that, you know, I know less about than most of the people in this room is that they start from the point of building that locally credible, locally grounded, locally resilient actor, because if in order to, you know, generate income, you need to have a good market presence in the local community. And so there's a sort of the starting point, the philosophy, if you will, I think is different. The other is around leapfrogging. I mean, Naina called it, you know, not being reliant on sort of Western solutions, and I think Frank talked about it in around, you know, the sort of cutting edge that we see in so many emerging markets. And I'm really excited about that, because in you know, one of our strategic priorities is valuing women's work. We think that you know, our priority over the next 10 years is to try to fundamentally change the way that societies think about women's work, whether that's paid or unpaid. What seems fascinating is that, you know, if you take the gig economy and digital platforms that are popping up all over the world, and in some ways are more interesting and dynamic in the developing world than that, you know, than the sort of Ubers in the global north, is inside those are mechanisms that we wouldn't have even dreamed about for, say, human resource development. That there are, you know, that all of a sudden you've got a class of actors, the owners of these platforms, who have an interest in training up those who are providing services on their platform. There is a better way of getting tools and information about human rights. We work in Bangladesh on something called Hello Task, which is a domestic worker gig economy platform. And what's fascinating is once you've connected domestic workers, service providers, into a platform like this, you have a much better way of informing them about their workers' rights or their human rights. You can tell them about, you know, safe spaces they can go if they need advice. And so there's so much happening at the sort of cutting edge, particularly around technology and you know, new sort of business models, that we should be leaning into, and we should be you know, unlocking some of that capacity. And those of us who work in the big international development NGOs like Oxfam, I think, are particularly well placed to do that, because, you know, we work in lots of countries, we can cross-pollinate, we have lots of partners. In our case, we have 3,600 partners. Although there too, I worry a little bit about the speed of change in these intermediary institutions, who I don't think are being agile enough, to be honest.
And most importantly, you have power and influence, right? You get to stand up at Davos every year and call out the billionaires. But I like what you said. Yeah, so notwithstanding our skepticism about how much stuff is changing, and we saw that in our research, you know, some people saying we're going to give less grants and less philanthropy because it's also uncertain, we don't know. And I wonder whether that's not wanting to pit global north versus global south, whether that's more a global north thing, whereas global south, since they're forced to find different solutions, are going ahead and driving innovation. And as you say, leapfrogging. And I like the point that you mentioned, that financial instruments, as they get more complex, in a way, ironically, have to become more aware of who they're investing in, right? And listen more to the investee than perhaps a grant. So a grant, you can kind of give it to somebody and that's it, you know, it gets used, it doesn't, you know, that's, whereas if you're investing with a more complex instrument, you really need to do your due diligence and understand the underlying operation. So I know that Naina wants to come in here. So why don't I just go straight over to you, Naina?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I mean, you know, I want to build on something that Danny said right in the beginning, which I completely agree with. We're talking about this whole shift the power. We're talking about, how are these new financial instruments really going to change sort of the status quo? Is it really happening on the ground? I agree with Danny. I don't think so. And, especially, and I want to bring that back to philanthropy, because I think here is where philanthropic capital can really play a role, where in philanthropists, especially in the global South, especially, in and if I look at Asia, which is the continent that I know best, you really look at countries across Asia, civil society is shrinking. It's shrinking because governments are taking a very strong stance that they find social investment, philanthropy, social capital as being something that's threatening. And so they're limiting the remit of civil society, even in countries where civil society historically has been very strong. So, to Danny's point, I think it's really important for us to see the role that a strong civil society can play in terms of social impact, in terms of development. And that is where I think philanthropists have to take a call on what they do. What is it that they fund? It is not enough to do what is good. It is very important to do what is right. And most philanthropists, especially those that come from, at least I'm going to talk about Asia. Asian philanthropists have traditionally not wanted to fund in areas of advocacy, have not wanted to fund in areas where, civil society gets a voice, not looked at funding or going against government or policymakers, and that's really important. And that's even really important if we are to look at social finance, if we are to look at impact investing, really making a change where it counts. And, some of the comments that I'm looking at that have been coming up in the chat as we've been talking are addressing that, right? In saying that if we look at the promise of impact investing, or we look at the promise of social finance in terms of really achieving or sort of bridging the kind of inequalities that exist, especially in the developing world, is it really being able to do that? Are we finding that impact investors are still funding in areas where, the risk is not as much, where, you are still assured of decent returns, whether you're looking at microfinance, microinsurance, micro mortgages? Those are things that have been proved. Are they really looking at addressing inequality? Are they looking at, what Danny talked about, the role of women, and, how do we actually compensate women across? And especially looking at Southeast Asia, Claire, an area which you're really interested in, a lot of women are not really compensated for the work that they do, whether it's informal work or even formal work. So are we looking at social investors looking at bridging that or investing in that? And that is where, if philanthropic capital comes in and, is that catalytic element that helps minimize that risk or bridge that risk, that can be truly transformational.
Yeah, very valid point, Naina, that perhaps we don't make often enough, that the OECD's report in 2018 on philanthropy and development pointed out that, we're supposedly risk capital, and yet still the majority of philanthropy goes into the safer areas of health and education, because you can measure it, because it doesn't offend governments, etc. Actually ends up doing the job of governments, which is
exactly.
Not ideal. But you give me a wonderful segue there for our second poll. So, and then after we've done the poll, I'm going to ask Kamal just to reflect on what he's heard. And then we will, ladies and gentlemen, don't worry, open up to the floor. I see there are a lot of questions coming in, so we will get to those. But first of all, if we can have our second poll come up, and which actually speaks to your point. So why do we want to do this? What is the benefit of deploying a range of financial instruments? Is it for reducing dependence on single source of funding, be that grants or aid? Is it because it creates more innovation? Is it because it creates more collaboration? Is it all of the above or none of the above? So just take a few seconds there to ponder that and see how what you've heard has perhaps hopefully reflected in your thinking, or maybe changed your thinking of this. Yes, sorry, Danny, panelists can't vote because the system, bless Zoom, doesn't allow for that. However, you are welcome to give your opinion once we have got the final poll results in. We just have a few more people voting, so we will give them a chance to finish, and then we will jump to Kamal to get his thoughts on the discussion to date before we go to the floor. So I think that's everybody. Yes, there we go. All of the above. Well, that's great. So really can drive innovation, collaboration, and reduce dependence. So 68% of you said that. 7% said none of the above. So do feel free to say what other things it might be. 12% looking at reduced funding, and 9% on more innovation, and 4% on collaboration. That's interesting that it's so low on collaboration, because one would suspect that perhaps by bringing multi-stakeholder actors into the space that might drive collaboration. Anyway, that's great. Thank you for the poll. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kamal. So Kamal, just give us your thoughts and reflections on what you've heard to date, and maybe a few questions, and then we will turn to the audience. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you for to all the panelists. What a fascinating discussion. Wonderful, inspirational discussion, and I have a feeling that we have just started the discussion really. So I would wouldn't want to talk for too long, and allow them to say more about the really important issues that they have raised, including the North-South relationship and philanthropy, the importance of civil society, limitations of grants, and on and so forth. And there's so much more to be said. But so let me perhaps just move the discussion forward by asking a couple of questions based on what has already been said. So Danny talked about workers' rights, empowering workers in the South, and so on, and Naina also touched upon this and talked about civil society, and this is of particular interest to us in the center, the North-South philanthropic relationship, and what I can hear you saying is, and I think you pretty much explicitly said that a couple of times, that grants have not been very good at empowering Southern organizations or beneficiaries, right? And there tends to be a perpetual ongoing dependence on Northern foundations from them. So my question to the panel is, sort of how and why will other forms of financing accomplish greater empowerment?
Thanks, Kamal. Great question. Who wants to take that one? And I'm going to ask all four of you to respond briefly, because I think it's an important question. Frank, you want to go? Isabelle, go ahead.
First thing, grants are hugely, hugely important, Kamal, but I think the purpose for grants, they shouldn't be ubiquitous. Grants are incredibly important at testing a new product, a new service, a new market. Instruments are long-term. If you're going to put in a financial instrument, you're there for a long time. Shell Foundation's experience is between 7 to 9 years minimum. So grants are really good to test a new management team. Why? Because there's a finite period. And if things aren't working out, the relationship breaks. Another thing in terms of the shifting the power very quickly, it's a new instrument I came across and I love it. And it's our most successful investment in Kenya. And I will say, Danny, to your point, it's an all-female Kenyan executive team, so I'm really proud of it. But we put in, it wasn't Sumerian. I'd love to take the credit, but it's not Sumerian. We put in a loan at $100,000 US. And we work with the management to say, what does success look like in terms of impact, right, by year 5? And it's in a hospital. It was around maternal health. We developed the KPIs for that. If the management team makes those KPIs, 50% of the loan shifts to a grant. It's alignment, and she's rewarded for success. We should see more of these types of instruments. So the instrument enables this organization to build a track record and potentially leverage different forms of finance, but she's rewarded on creating that impact. We should see more of these. So grants are not bad, and they can be used in very flexible formats, but there's a time and place for them.
And what would you call that instrument? A convertible loan?
Do you know what it's a loan where the repayment, 50% of the repayment goes to zero if they meet the impact.
That's not KPIs. A very snappy name, Isabelle.
No, we don't have it. We don't.
But that's great. Thank you. That's a brilliant example. Frank, your thoughts on is grant good?
You see, what Isabelle has described is the massive opportunity that this space now offers us. Innovation. A lot of the instruments we're able to play around with are bespoke.
Frank, your voice quality is...
Yeah, I think it's the connection, but let's just try again, Frank, and if not, we'll come back to you. Try again.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, maybe something wrong with my headphones. So what Isabelle's just described is a phenomenal example of the opportunities available in this space. They always say anywhere where you find a complaint or a problem is an opportunity for entrepreneurial thinking. And what she described is exactly what we are able to do in this space, is be very creative, be very bespoke. You don't have to copy the previous solution or anticipate the next one. You can create something that works for you, even if it doesn't have a name, as she's struggling to find one, but it works. This is the phenomenal opportunity. And I think for me, the grants in this case can do immeasurable and innumerable things. So one thing for sure, for example, grants can unlock local private capital. Okay, in coming into the risk local social investments, we can bring a lot more private sector players into this space. Whether you're looking at renewable energy, healthcare, education, we can make social investments attractive to private players. And this has been seen in innumerable things, but it's not being done at the scale and scope that we'd like to see to move capital that we need fast enough into this space. But this is why I'm in this space. It's exciting. There's so much we can do. And an example of what Isabelle is doing could be replicated by someone else with a slight deviation and a slight change, and it can be applied across multiple sectors. So, but de-risking, attracting, pulling out local capital is an example you can do. I think bringing in more private players into this space, because suddenly they can see that the risk returns of some of these things are better. And another thing, also very importantly, it changes our mindset from thinking that grants should only go where we give money with no financial returns. There are actually a lot of sustainable solutions that we can create that don't need to be built just on grants. They can actually be built around a market model and a business model, something that we've not been exposed to before. So it's super exciting to be in this space right now.
Thanks for that, Frank. That's great. And we're getting in the chat forgivable loan. Perhaps a little bit more common elsewhere. Naina, your thoughts, and then I'll come to Danny on grants. Are grants good?
Yeah, I think grants are good. I think, it's how you use grants. And to go back to Kamal's question about, how can grants actually increase empowerment? I think it's a question of where grants are directed to. And if you're looking at, impact investing, you're looking at scaling up of social entrepreneurs. I mean, the grant element can really be used in the TA portion, in the strategic capacity building portion, which oftentimes investors don't cater to. And, we've come up with a model that we're looking hopefully to launch, where grant money can actually be used to help incubators or accelerators work with social enterprises, work with social entrepreneurs to help scale them up, so that impact investors' money can then go in terms of really looking at achieving scaled outcomes, and the philanthropist money can actually go in terms of capacity building. So it's a question of where grant money comes in, where it's deployed towards. The other thing around empowerment is, actually how do we encourage philanthropists to take risks? You mentioned this very early on, Claire, that philanthropic capital is supposed to be the capital with the highest appetite of risk. And it's interesting, especially in Asia, where philanthropic money comes out of business. And most of these businessmen or businesswomen have made their money taking great risks. But yet, when it comes to philanthropy, they tend to be incredibly conservative and risk averse. They tend to look at the safest options. They tend to really not use some of the risk-taking behaviors that they have shown in their business world to come and transform into the philanthropic world. And that's the challenge I think that we have to do to get the needle to move forward.
Yeah, that is a strange phenomenon, isn't it? When they dump their commercial financial acumen when it comes to philanthropic investments. It's very strange. Danny, your thoughts on whether grants can empower?
Yeah, I think I like the way that Kamal put the question, which is sort of, what's wrong with the current system, and why will a different portfolio of philanthropic interventions make a difference? I mean, just to remind everyone what's wrong with the current system, because which is does have diverse interventions, is we are currently in a system that I think is just chronically disempowering to local actors. The closer you are to the communities you work with in the current system, the further you are away from power, it seems. And that's, we know the evidence base for that is that, only 1% of all bilateral aid actually goes directly to Southern civil society. I read a study the other day from the Foundation Center that looked at philanthropic grants in human rights around the world. Still 2/3 or something of global human rights funding goes to northern NGOs, even, who are supposed to then go out and promote human rights elsewhere in the world. So something is going on that's blocking in this sort of chain. And I think there are at least 3 reasons why a more diverse portfolio of interventions will make a difference. One is, I think it will incentivize fewer links in the chain. The current system, I think, is full of what I often call fundermediaries, people who are brokering financial transactions in this sort of ecosystem, including INGOs, by the way, because, we're always going to have the need for that, because, if you're a philanthropist sitting in San Francisco and your area of interest is halfway around the world, you're not necessarily going to go directly, and nor is it particularly efficient that we expect every philanthropist to go directly to the sort of people you're investing in. But I think the sorts of mechanism we're starting to see bypass some of those links in the chain, and you still have brokers, intermediaries, aggregators, but have a next generation of them, which I think will be more empowering. Secondly is around the type of institutions that are supported, and I think there's a question from Sarah here about sort of what's the regulatory block here, is that traditional grant-based philanthropy often tends to privilege traditional forms of civil society, charities, if you will. It might be a bit weird for someone who works for a charity, but I don't think I work in the cutting edge of where social change happens, and we need new mechanisms that are supporting the cutting edge, and that might be social enterprise, it might be what we call B Corps or whatever else it is. And so I think these new instruments are more likely to create a more diverse set of actors, therefore driving social change. And then third is Naina's point around the regulatory impact of what's happening in too many countries around the world, where governments are literally attacking to the most critical bits of civil society, including by restricting their ability to access funds from abroad. Dozens of countries have enacted it. And so a new set of tools that look less like charitable financing, but nevertheless support social change, I think are also a good buffer for us to try against sort of regulatory undermining of this sort of social good finance. So those are 3 reasons why I think that a more diverse portfolio will help.
Kamal, do you want to come? Thanks, Danny. That's great. Kamal, come back in.
Just one more question, Claire. This is fascinating, and the center is based in a business school, so I'll ask a question about the private sector and the incentives that we have, because and Isabelle touched upon it, and Danny, Naina, Frank also briefly touched upon it. So we are seeing a lot of statements and a lot of rhetoric about impact investment, about corporate purpose, and so is there a difference between rhetoric and reality here? So let me give you an example. Tech companies, for example, which I sort of study, have been at the forefront of self-regulation movement by adopting ESG standards, and that ensure these companies play well with other stakeholders in their ecosystems. But at the same time, it has been pointed out that these companies are not exactly doing society any favors. These higher ESG performers generally pay markedly lower taxes and employ 20% fewer employees in comparison to sometimes poorly ranked ESG companies. So, is there a need to actually reform the governance of these large businesses? Why are only investors represented on boards? I mean, you heard about the example, the Danone case, where Emmanuel Faber, was basically fired by the board, who was all about corporate purpose and ESG and so on and so forth, because he wasn't really generating the returns that they expected. I mean, why not include all stakeholders on the board? So the question really is, can we achieve anything meaningful without moving away from shareholder capitalism?
That's a big question, Kamal. Thank you. Who's brave enough to go for it? I'm going to ask just maybe a couple of our panelists, and then we'll go to the audience Q&A. Who wants to give that one a shot?
Wow, Kamal.
Go for it.
That bigger question is a very big question, is changing the definition of fiduciary duty, because you have, on a listed company, you've kind of handcuffed what the board can do because of the legal liabilities around fiduciary duty. So by the way, and there's work being done around that. So people are put in a difficult position because of that tension that's arising, long-term shareholder value versus quarterly performance. The second point in the rhetoric on impact investing, maybe I'll say something controversial, is 90+% of impact investing is looking for market rate returns. However, the opportunity set, the demand side, that opportunity needs more concessional philanthropic funding, right? So there's a mismatch between what the demand side needs versus what impact investing rhetoric is delivering. There is a massive mismatch there. Until that mismatch changes, I would say, I'll use an analogy. Clare knows my business partner, a glacier. At the tip of the glacier, right, is really where that 90% of money, that's the opportunity set. The rest, we need philanthropic money to shift into different forms of concessional finance. So sorry, long-winded answer, but
brilliant. Thank you, Isabelle. That's a brilliant explanation. Thank you. And Danny, you wanted to come in on that question?
Look, there's nothing is going to replace better regulation and more effective regulation for social good. I think we have had, I think Frank said it before, that the sort of regulation is catching up to too slowly, and ESG or corporate governance is a good one. I think we need much more activist investors. The best email I got yesterday was news that the pension company, the fund that manages the Oxfam pension, has signed up to a campaign we're involved in called Make My Money Matter, and they've committed to halving their emissions of their investments in this decade and signing up to net zero by 2050. And they hold 13.9 billion pounds worth of pension funds, and not all Oxfam pensions, by the way. And you know, that's great. That's the sort of commitment we want. And so you squeeze from every different way. But the one reason why I think there is your question relates so nicely to the topic we're talking about is, again, it might be strange for me who works in a charity to say this, but I think part of the problem, and it's a peculiarly Anglo-Saxon problem, is for about 400 years or so, we've created this notion of a registered charity over here to do good and to do wonderful stuff around that. And every other formation in society was free to go and do whatever it want, pillage the environment, exploit people, do whatever, low regulation, go for it, right? I don't think the rest of the 21st century is going to be bettered by either, at scale, by either end of this spectrum. And somewhere in the middle lies a better regulated, triple bottom line, whatever set of institutions you want to call them. And we need to push towards that by whatever. And that's where I think why the question around new forms of philanthropic investment, ushering in or creating a new generation of entities in this middle area is particularly important, and why it's a sort of generational change, I think, that we're part of.
Thank you, Danny. And another brilliant answer to a brilliant question. I know that Frank and Naina are probably dying to answer that as well, and I'm going to give them the chance, but I'm wondering if Frank and Naina, you can include your answers with answers to other questions. I want to try and do a quick fire, zipping through the questions we've had from the audience so that they get their say too. So we have a question from Sarah on what are the barriers that funders face in changing their model? Is it just the mindset? Is it the need of funders to quantify their direct impact? Is it the charity commission? Is it the regulation? So why do funders find it so difficult to change their model? I'm going to pitch that to Naina and ask you, Naina, if you also want to come back on Kamal's point.
Thanks, Claire. So on Kamal's point, I think one of the things that we do need to look at is who sits on boards, and how are boards really representing the organizations that they choose to regulate. So, I do think that that's a whole different panel that we need to go into in terms of board representation. And really, when we look at changing the whole dynamic and, getting voices that are least heard on the table. I think part of it is looking at who is on the boards, who are on boards, and how do we push that along. To your question, Claire, to Sarah's question rather, about changing philanthropists' mindsets. I think it's a mindset in philanthropy which needs to be changed. And it's not so much about regulation, although regulation plays a role in terms of how philanthropists can invest their philanthropic money in for-profit enterprises. So that's where in some countries, at least in Asia, as a philanthropic organization or a foundation, you cannot be giving a grant or philanthropic money to a social enterprise if that social enterprise is construed as a for-profit enterprise. So that's where regulation comes in. But I think more than the regulatory part of it, it is a mindset change. And oftentimes we found that, philanthropists tend to look at it as sort of, left pocket, right pocket, where, in my right pocket, I am looking at giving away the money, but I therefore don't want to put in, all of these kinds of measures of measurement of what impact that money is having, or, where it's going. So I'm just giving away that money, and I'm just giving it away to a charity, or I'm giving it away. But that percentage of what I'm giving away is really, really small. Moment I look at it as an investment, or I look at it as a business, I come into what Isabelle so beautifully described as that tip of that glacier. I want to put my money in where I'm actually seeing a return. I'm not so, I do say, yes, I'm looking at the social impact, but that social impact part just comes in sort of making the choice of the investment. I immediately then pivot into looking at financial returns, and I start putting a lot of pressure on the entrepreneur in terms of his or her business model, in terms of the financial return that is coming. And when we talk to social entrepreneurs, we find that they are under so much pressure then to kind of move away from their impact focused mindset to looking at a financial returns mindset.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naina. Going to the next question, which I think needs to go to Frank, because he talked about youth from Hilal around, okay, it's great that we want to, shift the power to youth-led, youth-driven work. We know that a rising commitment to getting young people involved in decision-making, but how do we resource them up beyond just giving them grants? How do we empower the youth? One for you, Frank.
Yeah, so I had a real privilege to work with young people when I worked at the African Leadership Academy. And I saw the power of trusting young people. It's almost like when you look at the question about women, we tend to think, oh, when you're dealing with women, that's a charity thing we do after we've done everything else. It's the same thing with youth. We feel that they're too young to be empowered. And I've seen the power of trusting young people and giving them the right knowledge and the right exposure and the right experience at a very young age. I mean, at the African Leadership Academy, we admitted young African kids from as far as refugee camps across the continent at the age of 16. We taught them entrepreneurial thinking. They had to run businesses on campus. They had to report to boards while running those businesses. And you'll not believe this. If you look at the alumni network now, where the oldest kids are about 28 now, 77% of those kids between the age of 28 and 16, 77% of those kids are running enterprise across the continent. Because you give them the right foundation. We've got to trust these things. So this once again, our own mindset has to shift. Okay, we've got to find the opportunities in all of these things. It's just like women. I mean, I look at the opportunity in Africa. If we got gender equality right in Africa between now and 2025, there's a 10% GDP growth opportunity. It's not just about doing a good thing, it's doing the right thing. Okay, so it's all about how we as adults have to lean on our biases. The same biases we had on racism and other things. We've got to change how we view the world, and only then can the world change based on the lens we apply. So I'm a big believer in that kind of stuff. But I want to point something on the question you asked, Naina, about what some of the stuff holding philanthropists back is also a lack of know-how in playing in this new impact investing space. They don't know. Because you're looking at a board, you're looking at a management team that have spent 20 years in philanthropy. All they've known is get proposals, I've got a grant, how much do I give? That kind of stuff. No one's taught them a different way of looking at life. And that's our job. That's what Naina and I do, and Isabelle and Danny, is how do we change their view of the world, recognizing that the demand for the capital is so much more than what they have. And this is why we are doing the fellowship program with Naina, because we've realized that unless we shift their mindset and understand that actually don't use your $100 as $100 of a grant, use your $100 to unlock $10,000. Yeah. And this is how you do it. And this is how we're going to walk you through an impact investing program to do that. And I'll post the program on the chat, but we've got to change the know-how. We have board members who've been in philanthropy for 50 years or whatever, how long they've been. You can't just expect that guy to embrace impact investing today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Frank. Do post your link to the fellowship, and kudos to you guys for setting that up. I think this is a great community we're creating. I hope our exec ed program also contributes to this space, but clearly a lot more to be done. Question from Priya, which I'm going to throw to Isabelle. So Priya wants to know, how do we offset this aversion to investing in sometimes the creative and cultural or informal economies, chicken and egg situation? Often there isn't enough data, so they can't get an investment. So how can philanthropy intentionally bridge traditionally marginalized sectors? And I pitch that to you, Isabelle, because I think sometimes you've been working with social entrepreneurs who are perhaps in more marginalized areas, and yet you've managed to fund them and support them.
Yeah, I think that question leads to a lot of funds. And by the way, this is not intentional, but by the way they work, they're not inclusive because they expect the communities already to be investment ready. So this is what we do at Sumerian, is we provide intensive pre-investment support. So we always back a team, and if the team has shown a level of delivery of impact, so a track record on impact, we will help build up the business plan. And by what I mean by business plan, what does a strategy look like? It's often in the entrepreneur's head. We help put that together. We translate that into the numbers. We put in policies, procedures as the pre-investment support. What does the instrument look like? We're doing this all together with the entrepreneurs as pre-investment support before the money even goes in. Not only that, we're assuming they're raising the right amount of money and the right form of instrument. And I will say, we didn't realize that the supply side was being exclusive. I stress this is not intentional. We were not intentional either. We saw a massive gap, and that's how we became inclusive. We really want others to copy and paste this model, because by default, you will be more inclusive in targeting more of these marginalized communities. So I hope that answers the question.
And hats off to you guys for leading the way in that front. I mean, it is a fairly unique case, but that's great that you're doing that. Thank you, Isabelle. A great question, which lends itself very nicely to Danny, from Karen. Danny's comment about fundermediaries. So Danny, do panelists value the role of intermediary organizations that offer an accompanying approach, capacity building to local indigenous civil society organizations within a partnership model?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Next question.
I think we need, we do need intermediaries, and we will for some time to come, but we just need to be much more intentional about their roles, make sure that they're not hogging power and resources. And there are some fantastic examples. And I look to the women's rights movement, where the Global Fund for Women or the African Women's Development Fund have become sort of re-granting mechanisms, or I think there's a Global Fund for Community Philanthropy that's here on the call. There's no shortage of those sort of thoughtful mechanisms to try to support and empower and resource local civil society and organizations. But even in this space, I think we do have a pipeline problem, right? And I know that it's in the commercial market. I was talking to an impact investor in Africa, one of the, who's running £1 billion fund at the moment. She was saying that they had to go through 1,000 companies or so in order to arrive at 3 that they ended up investing in. And so if you think about, the world out there, which is full of all of these challenges, who's going to do that work, that heavy lift of identifying and bringing in, potential investors who are ready? And I think that, speaking frankly, I think that is one role that international NGO networks like Oxfam can play. And so, in fact, working with Chris West, we set up something called the Enterprise Development Program. We're about to launch its 3rd phase, looking for £50 million worth of capital, because we're identifying, again, women-owned economic enterprises in a bunch of countries that we have worked with, or we are working with, to bring them up to a point where they can then, use those resources well. So I think it's, we have to be much more intentional about sort of what we're doing, which is creating long-term, diverse, resilient institutions that can then go on and drive social good, but also be intentional about the sort of the types of institutions that we have in that ecosystem, and be transparent and honest about the role that they're playing, and have feedback loops that hold us to account. Because that's the other thing that seems we're so short of, is really accountability. How many philanthropists say, well, they ask their grantee, by the way, how good have we been with our grant? And the grantee says, fantastic.
You gave us money. We love you. Yeah, absolutely. Accountability. Brilliant. Thanks, Danny. So a nice question from Casey for Naina. Something that Naina, you spoke about earlier when we did some of our work on the COVID, about this locally sourced philanthropy. How do we encourage that and this shift? So as in Global South realizes that maybe there isn't all this money coming from the Global North anymore, is there a need to push international donors to invest in building the philanthropic ecosystem to support local sourced philanthropy? Naina, over to you.
Absolutely. I firstly think that there is a big case for encouraging philanthropists to support ecosystem builders. I think Frank and I are very much in agreement on that. In terms of really looking at supporting locally sourced intermediaries, locally sourced networks, I think that's key. I think that's key also because you can then find, go beyond the usual suspects of organizations that you can also find to fund. A lot of times what we find is that even if, especially when you're looking at these big grants that are coming from the West, and they're very appreciated, they're unrestricted large grants that are coming into developing economies, but they go to the same organizations over and over again. And part of the reason is that we don't have local networks that are funded that actually can source smaller indigenous organizations that are working close to the ground. So by doing that, you can actually surface so many other organizations that are really working with marginalized communities, that are working on the coalface, that otherwise are not in the front of funders. So by doing that, it I think achieves two goals with one shot.
Absolutely. Thank you, Naina. So sadly, we are running out of time. We still have time for a few more questions. I'm going to pick one question for each of our panelists, and I'm going to ask you at the same time, just if you have any closing remarks. So this one comes to you, Isabelle, because it is specifically on the financial instruments. It's from Vineet. And apologies to the audience. I have to admit, summarizing some of your questions because some of them are quite long and just for the sake of time. But Isabelle, it does having financial instruments, is it helpful because having different financial instruments, is it helpful because it unlocks additional pools of capital, or the different instruments themselves have value?
Brilliant question. Every business model is different. Organizations need different instruments at different stages. That's why in the commercial world, we have a slew of instruments, right? So it's never one size fits all. The instrument has to match what the organization is trying to achieve. We find, and again, we'll say another thing that's controversial, equity is probably not the right instrument in most cases. Why? It does not self-liquidate. So how are you ever going to exit? So you should look at instruments if you are a social entrepreneur that are self-liquidating. I'd even argue if you're an impact investor, self-liquidating that match the cash flow needs of that organization. So that's a very quick answer to the question, but it's a very long. I can go on and on, but I would say the organization needs to shift to self-liquidating instruments. Sorry, the industry needs to shift to self-liquidating instruments.
Thank you, Isabelle. That's great advice, and throughout the discussions, you've given us some really great insights and really specific technical insights. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to send Heather's question to Frank. So Heather would like to know about how Western countries could shift some of their focus from helping others, the savior complex, to stopping the harm that we cause. For example, the trade rules we impose, the environmental systems we've created. If we take responsibility for stopping and cleaning up our harm, change would accelerate for people in the Global South, as well as the poor communities in the Global North. What do you think to that, Frank? And also your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, I think you've got to trust. We appreciate the help we get from the outside. There's no question about it. And we will forever be grateful for that. But you've got to appreciate the fact that we've lived the problem. We can live the solution. Trust us. trust us to contribute to that solution and not to be just a recipient of what you think the solution is. I think it's very important to recognize that in many cases, actually, some of the solutions already exist amongst the recipients. They just need the resources to be brought to life and to scale. So too many times, I think there's a savior mentality that comes with money that comes from outside. And no, in many cases, a lot of this stuff, we know the solution. We just don't have the resources because our governments are not helping us and we don't have the money to do it. So trust us in that context. But I think in the bigger scheme, in terms of closing remarks, you know, the type of mindset this community of people has is we go towards challenges. We are attracted to problems. And this is a time when there's some really exciting problems that need to be solved, that require us to think very creatively. And I think there's no better time for philanthropy to play a really catalytic, risk-taking role to not only bring to bear new innovations, but also unlock a lot more capital than we've ever had in the past. And more sustainable capital for that matter, especially in the context as aid is reducing to Africa and those kind of, and a lot of emerging markets. And part of it is a crisis of success because more African countries are moving to middle income status and becoming less deserving of aid. So it's not a bad thing, but I think this is the time philanthropy should really be coming to build sustainable systems of impact delivery. And we'd be very happy to work with anyone who's in that vein of thought.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Some powerful closing thoughts from you. Much appreciated. And a nice segue to the question for Danny from Nicola, which is beautifully aligned. It's as if we scripted these questions. I promise we didn't. So Nicola would like to know, Danny, isn't this reduction in aid, UK aid, perhaps an opportunity to direct funding away from INGOs and using your fundamediaries idea to shift it towards local, move beyond the savior behaviors and balance up some of these power dynamics? Well, and your closing thoughts as well, please.
Yeah, thank you. I like Nicola's silver lining sort of mentality. I share it. But on this one, I mean, for me, what was sort of gutting over the last few days is, you know, there's been an 80% cut from the UK funding for water and sanitation in the middle of a global pandemic, 60% reduction in humanitarian funding to places like Yemen, where we know people will die as a result of that. And meanwhile, exactly that same amount the UK government is increasing its defence funding by. So this is just a political choice that smacks, you know, that just sort of sits really heavily with me. And I think with a lot of the British population, which, by the way, is giving more generously. You know, the latest data insight in the UK is people are, you know, are responding to the pandemic in a much, you know, a more compassionate way, which is reassuring. But in terms of bilateral aid, only about 13% of all bilateral aid goes through NGOs. So it's a relatively small amount that we get. I agree with you that needs to be spent more responsibly and more empoweringly, and more of it needs to go directly to the global south. But the wider point, right back to where we started with this pandemic, I think is, you know, I think this pandemic has made it abundantly clear that the sorts of financing mechanisms we have to support global public goods were inadequate before the pandemic, but this pandemic has revealed them to be inadequate to face up to the sort of big pressing global challenges we have. And so too have the sorts of responses and mechanisms we've had in place to protect, you know, people, their livelihoods. And so that's the radical moment here, to sort of step right back and say, what for the rest of the 21st century how might the financing of global public goods look like? And aid might be a part of that, but it's only ever going to be a tiny part of it. And the rest of it is up to people like us, I think, to try to you know, invent, test, and deploy in a strategic way. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. You've been scaring us, but inspiring us at the same time. So brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much. Final question to Naina. I'm sorry for the others that have asked questions. We will maybe try to come to you offline. A question from Celia about, is there a site where you can find available grants from all over the world to support youth? And I pitched that to you, Naina. You can do a small ad for the AVPN, because I think you guys are doing some amazing work around data collection and understanding what capital is going where. So if you can just speak to that and also give us your closing remarks, that'd be great.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Claire. And, you know, what an amazing discussion this has been. I've really enjoyed it. So Celia, yeah, on youth, I mean, AVPN is actually launching a platform around looking at livelihood creation for youth. Like Frank spoke earlier about Africa. In Asia, we have a number of countries where we have a very young population, and the challenge in these countries is how do we actually get youth linked to jobs. So we've just got funding to actually do this platform. So if you're looking for Asian funders who are funding youth jobs for youth, livelihood programs for youth, please do go to the AVPN website and look at our deal share platform. You will find organizations that are interested in supporting youth livelihoods across Asia. In terms of closing comments, I think just building off what Danny just said, which was really powerful. The pandemic has really exposed the chinks, the cracks, the weaknesses in the global system overall. If we really look at 2030, we're 9 years away from it, right? And the hope was that we would have the SDGs achieved. We would be a much more inclusive, a much more equal society. We're so far away from that. In Asia alone, we're going backwards on goal number 5, which is the gender goal. We're going backwards on livelihoods. We're going backwards on nutrition instead of going forwards. And yet we are the part of the world where the most number of the world's billionaires will be created going forward. So, I mean, I think this is a time when we actually ponder and ask ourselves, what is the kind of world that we are building? We've all taken this 18 months to pause, to work from home, to change the way that we look and think. We really need to think, what is it that we're leaving behind for our children and for our grandchildren? What kind of society do we want to build? Do we want to live somewhere? Do we have the conscience to live somewhere where children are still being stunted because of lack of nutrition, where, women have no rights? I mean, that's not the society I want to leave for my children and my grandchildren. So I think for each and every one of us today, we need to ask, what is it that we need to do to build a more equal society, to build a more inclusive society? And that starts with us, and it goes to philanthropists. It goes to the fact that even in the worst pandemic that any of us have seen in our lifetime, the rich have gotten richer. And the poor have gotten poorer. So, it's very important to move beyond the talk and move to action and see what we can do. How can we push with our votes, with our voices, with our dollars?
Thank you so much, Naina. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Danny, to Isabelle, to Frank, to Kamal. You have all been brilliant, 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 and inspiring. If you've enjoyed this, please do join us at our next seminar on the 2nd of September. Kamal, just a final closing thought from you, and then we will see you all next time. And a huge thank you to our audience, and check us out on YouTube and our social media channels. Over to you, Kamal, for the final words.
Well, I think I consider myself fortunate to be amongst, such amazing people. So much wisdom based on grassroots level, decades of experience. Just going by the comments in the chat, I think everyone has really appreciated our panelists coming together to discuss some crucial issues. So really nothing else to say, but on behalf of the center, the business school, and the university, thank you, Naina, thank you, Isabelle, thank you, Frank, and thank you, Danny, for such a stimulating discussion. And we hope to reconvene soon to continue this.
See you next time, everybody. Bye.